Yo guys, Vision SGN here bringing you Marvel Rivals Best Competitive Team Part 10, where we'll be breaking down the third best lineup to be using right now in competitive following the latest Season 2 update, using all different heroes to my previous two lineups in the new season, which can be used to both counter the number 1 and number 2 lineups in the game as of right now. And if you want to know what they are, go check out my previous episodes number 8 and 9, which are on the channel and linked in the description below. So on that note, let's get right into it. So this starting lineup will consist of characters that have not been used in the previous two lineups for the starting initial lineup itself, and I'll explain how to use each of the 6 heroes in this video based on their roles, whilst also identifying what adjustments you'll want to consider throughout, explaining when you'd make them and why. And as for the roster itself, I won't be going over a guide as such on all of their individual abilities for each of the heroes, as I've made guides separately on the channel for these, and for the most part I am assuming that anyone that's watching these videos and learning about the best competitive teams right now following the latest updates is already somewhat fully aware of all or most of these heroes anyways and their abilities. Now, in this video, I'll be explaining the best meta teams to be using and heroes right now in Season 2, and will continue to provide for future episodes a combination of meta and as well as unique lineups going forward, which you can basically try out for yourselves, and hopefully you'll have as much fun as using these heroes, and especially within these specific lineups, based on the latest buffs and sort of nerfs throughout the season updates. Now, of course, not all of these lineups or heroes will work in competitive. Depending on your rank, as well as your individual skill level, you should probably try some of these heroes and team comps out in a more casual environment first, which is less consequential. That way, you'll get a somewhat more comfortable and more familiar with these heroes and how they work in these lineups. But this one is certainly a viable lineup to be using right now in competitive in the latest update, and can be effective at countering, as I mentioned, episodes 8 and 9 teams. So go check out those videos to see what those heroes are. But as for this lineup, as usual, we'll be starting with the tanks, and for this setup, we will be using as normal pretty much what I go to for the most part, a 2-tank setup. It's my personal preference and what I believe to be the most effective strategy. Now, in this lineup, we will be using Groot, Venom, Wolverine, Star-Lord, Adam Warlock, and Mantis. So a 2-2-2 setup, which contains 2 Vanguards, 2 Duelists, and 2 Strategists. Now, starting with Groot, he is effectively going to be your primary tank, your damage blocker, utilizing his walls, which are also really useful for separation and isolation of other dive heroes, to basically trap them on your side, allow them to basically be isolated so that your team can help work together to pick them off and then push through with the numbers advantage. That's kind of the idea of how you use Groot and how you want to sort of progress through the map, especially on the payload objective, where you sort of set up in a sequence and waves sort of thing. Every single team fight, you want to make sure that Groot is leading the way, putting good walls in good locations, and then utilizing those walls as a team, as a surrounding team, to make sure you're actually making the most of those walls. Now, as for the second character, for Venom, he is my personal favorite hero in the entire game. I love playing this character. He is the dive main for this squad, responsible for area of effect, in and out of pressure to delay pace of game, prevent backline DPSs from basically being effective, and also picking off supports when they are isolated, making sure they cannot get their ultimates as fast as possible. And this combination between a mobile tank and a slow damage mitigating tank works really well for the most part. Now, as for the third hero on the squad and the first duelist, we'll be using Wolverine. He is effectively the tank destroyer, effective at removing Magneto, Strange, Hulk, or even Emma Frost, effective for grouped up damage and pressure and isolation heroes, so works really, really well with Groot, especially when you can sort of take them back to your team. You can peel back to your team with an enemy in your hands and make sure that you sort of eliminate them and isolate them and make sure that you gain that numbers advantage. Same as with Groot, as I mentioned, they work really well together. Now, as for the second duelist and the fourth hero in the squad, we'll be using Star-Lord. He is effectively one of the best final hit specialists, and executioner is what I refer to them as, someone who's capable at applying constant pressure, using his evasive and damage abilities. His ultimate is one of the most impactful ultimates in the entire game for clearing a wave of enemies and winning team fights, and when timed right and prepared basically alongside Mantis' damage buff, or even the likes of Rocket, he can melt through tanks and clear squishy targets with ease, making him really, really effective and almost a very intimidating ultimate when you hear the sound cue. Now, maintaining this rebirth team up ability and trying to make the most of that, we're going to be using Warlock for the fifth hero for the squad and the first healer. He is only really a second healer, but he's a great strategist, which is key to understand. His sniping ability is really effective at removing aerials and other ranged healers, but also high burst DPS is really effective for the likes of dive heroes that sort of pressure you. So he almost acts as a bit of a sniper as well as a counter dive hero, and if precise, he basically is one of the best in the entire game. He's just often used quite wrong, so there's a bit of a stigma with him when players see him use him, but also he's not an effective healer as such, so this is also where he sort of falls down for the most part. But he also adds that great clutch factor with his ultimate ability, and of course, as I mentioned, the rebirth team up ability with Star-Lord and as well as Mantis. So seeing what we are already using Star-Lord and Warlock, for the sixth hero, we are going to maintain again that rebirth team ability, and for the sixth hero and the second healer, we are going to be using Mantis, who will be the final pick for this squad, a primary healer for this squad, not necessarily the best healer by any means. However, her damage buffing capability abilities massively help her out and make her really useful for this team. And as well as this, she is also an effective counter dive hero, with her sleep ability being one of the best and only CC strategists in the entire roster. However, she, as I mentioned, is not a main or high tier healer in my opinion, as she provides minimal instant heals and only really benefits from healing over time, which isn't that effective for the most part, and is where she also falls down as well. And it's often why you see the two strategists set up needing a third. You need that sort of primary healer, someone that has a defensive ultimate that's really, really good and effective, like Luna, Invis, or Cloak and Dagger maybe. However, she is a really good healer. The key you need to understand with it is the 8-second cooldowns with the leafs that she basically adds and sort of applies to teammates, and just making sure that whoever's playing Mantis, or if you're playing Mantis, that you're tracking your team and you're keeping an eye on the indicators that are green and blue on the right side of your screen. That gives you an idea of when each of your teammates' healing or damage is falling off, because that's where she's going to be really effective. But she's also a sneaky assassin with a high burst DPS. People forget that, so it's why she really, really works in a 3 support setup, because you basically gain a second duelist with her if you're having her basically primarily focus on dealing damage, her crit shots, which basically helps the character out massively. And if you are doing that, then you are going to benefit massively in a 3 support setup. However, for this setup, it will definitely work in a 2 support setup, which I'll go over the adjustments later if you need to at any reason when you notice, like I said, defensive ultimates being the main reason you're struggling in a game, and so on. Now, with a structured team, you just need to consider and understand your team lineup and the strengths and weaknesses. So, as an example, what I just mentioned is the healing for this squad isn't exactly S tier, and there could be differences or adjustments that you could make to improve that if that's the issue and that's the strength you want to work on. Now, understanding your own team's counters and your team ups and all of the meta heroes in the game is also key, which we're obviously going over in this episode and in previous episodes. And also, communication is very key. People just don't speak up or don't necessarily text in the chat and just say what the issues are throughout the game. Right at the start of the game, it's key that you just look at a lineup and you see, maybe based on the bans, who you need to adjust to and figure out what you're lacking, i.e. you may not have dive heroes and therefore you may have too many dive heroes. It could be a difference or a contrast, but you need to understand that there's issues that from the start you need to iron them out and get them communicated with your team and help everyone understand as an overview of your team what you're going to be really good at, and making sure you are utilizing your strengths and also working around your weaknesses. And just understanding that basis is really, really important. It's called reading between the lines, and a lot of players in the higher ranks of competitive really understand this, and this is where you excel. And if you don't, this is where you're going to fall down and massively lose your games, especially in domination. When you get to rounds 2 and 3, if you go the distance, you will understand that teams just make changes throughout and they adjust, and that is because they're communicating and they're figuring issues out right throughout the game and making the necessary adjustments that are required, which I'll go over shortly for this lineup. Now, as for who you want to ban and why, there are certain counters for this squad based on your team strengths and your weaknesses. The first one for me would be banning the counter dive specialist, i.e. Namor. He would be one of the first ones I would ban for the squad. He's going to really disrupt the likes of Venom and maybe even Star-Lord and Wolverine from being effective if he's in the squad, especially considering you don't really have anyone with absolute range. Maybe, of course, Warlock, but it's quite a responsibility to rely on him to have to deal with the octopuses. As well as this, I would probably consider banning Winter Soldier due to him being a really effective counter for the likes of Groot, and his high sustain just provides issues. Or even maybe Psylocke, due to the annoying evasive playstyle. She can be quite a pain in the arse, and especially hard for Star-Lord to even track. So maybe if he's an effective Star-Lord, you just can leave Psylocke. But for the most part, I would definitely consider banning the Winter Soldier and Namor. Now, I wouldn't necessarily ban any tanks, of course, as you have Wolverine. And if he, of course, is then banned, then maybe you want to consider banning the tanks. But if you do get Wolverine through, definitely leave all the tanks, because he is literally your tank destroyer, and that's where he's going to be effective. Now, I would also consider maybe banning a main healer. Who you won't rotate into the lineup throughout the game is someone you could consider banning, due to the fact that you don't want defensive ults changing the entire outcome of your game, and considering you're not going to be using one, unless you, of course, switch to a 3 support setup, as I've mentioned, you won't need that sort of main healer, and it would massively help you guys out if their other team doesn't have 2 primary healers, such as Luna and maybe Invisible Woman. It will make a big, big difference. I've noticed it plenty of times in the past. Certain maps just cater for better defensive ultimates, especially on the sort of Vigorosil and the sort of Loki map. You will notice that defensive ults placed in the right locations can really make it really, really difficult for your team, almost like a stalemate, and just removing one of those from the games, not giving them that option, can be really crucial. Now, as for the adjustments, when you'd make them and why, starting with Groot, if the other team does have a Wolverine as well, or even a Winter Soldier, and is being extremely effective at removing your Groot and isolating him, then I would maybe consider changing to the likes of Thor for better sustain, keeping that mobility and pairing alongside the likes of Venom, or Captain America for the Winter Soldier team up and brawling playstyle that I will basically add into the adjustments later on. Now, as for Venom, if the other team has a Penny Parker or has figured out how to isolate Venom via basically being a counter dive, or just his dives in general aren't effective, consider then changing him to a ground-based shielding tank for damage mitigation, but also range damage instead, to remove the likes of traps from Penny and deal area of effect damage to grouped up enemies, as that's sort of what you're going for with the likes of Venom. And if they figure out how to isolate him with maybe Mantis or Penny or so on, then you would definitely want to then consider changing, and this sort of shielding style tank will basically change the dynamic of your system. Now, as for Wolverine, if he is banned, which is very, very likely for the most part in my own experience, or the other team has a Penny Parker as well, as I mentioned with Venom, maybe you might want to consider changing Wolverine, as this is where he is not effective, or maybe the other team just doesn't have any grounded tanks and they're running a one tank setup. This is where he is less effective. Then I would maybe consider changing it to the likes of Squirrel Girl for the splash damage to grouped up enemies or removal of traps, or if the other team doesn't have any counter dive setups, maybe change to the likes of Magic to add that dual dive setup with the likes of Captain America and Thor, or even Venom, depending on obviously who you change your tanks to, and that could really, really work and be effective, as well as changing the entire dynamic of your team if needed to when you make your adjustments. Now, as for Star-Lord, if you need a third healer, obviously then change Wolverine to a third support, because that's probably the most likely thing to do and best setup in my opinion. A better primary healer such as Invis or Luna could change the entire dynamic of your team, or you could change Star-Lord to these heroes if you want, and you want to maintain that sort of Wolverine, Squirrel or Magic, depending on obviously who you adjust to. If you need to, you could just change that. But if the two strategy setup is working, however, and Star-Lord isn't really effective, more commonly due to enemies all being grouped up, where our Star-Lord is less effective because he can't isolate anyone, then maybe you consider changing to the likes of Moon Knight, who I know is not that high tier of a sort of a duelist in this game currently, but when enemies are all grouped up, Moon Knight is really, really good at applying constant damage and getting his ultimate really together, and basically allows to alleviate and disperse grouped up enemies, making him more effective. And then you could simply just change back once they sort of have that and change that dynamic in general. Now, together with Squirrel Girl, the two of them can be really, really effective, as I mentioned, at removing those grouped enemies, implying insane amounts of damage. And as I mentioned, with the initial setup, it would be quite almost like a surprise element to change these two heroes as your duelist setup, because no team would really expect it, and then obviously you can just change back if needed to go back to your original setup. Now, as for Warlock, if you need a 2 duelist and 2 tank setup, therefore you're only going to have 2 supports, and this setup isn't working because you need more heals, then consider changing to a better primary healer such as Invis, Luna, or even Cloak. And especially if you do change Star-Lord, he becomes a bit more less useful because he doesn't provide that team ability for the likes of him and of course Mantis. So therefore it is a quick change to just remove Warlock and keep Mantis, and then have a better primary healer for the squad. Now, if you do change Warlock to a better primary healer, you can likely then keep Mantis in the squad for her damage buffing capabilities and crowd control abilities. However, if you add Moon Knight into the squad for his adjustment, and the healing over time from Mantis just isn't what you guys need, then I would consider changing her to Cloak and Dagger for better instant heals, team ability with Moon Knight, but also a better defensive ultimate all around, and also adds that similar damage buffing effect with the likes of Mantis, with the fact that she can apply, or Cloak and Dagger can apply the vulnerability effect to enemies and making them a lot easier to eliminate for your entire squad. So it's similar in an aspect that it doesn't increase the damage output of such, but it does actually make the enemies a lot more vulnerable and easier to kill. So same sort of aspect. And then as for the team abilities of all of the named heroes in this list, there's not that many. It's a bit of a shorter one, but as a quick summary, here are the potential link-ups to consider. So you obviously get the first one, which is the Warlock, Star-Lord, and Mantis team abilities. The second one would be the Captain America and Winter Soldier, if that's the adjustments you change to. And then the third and final one will be the Cloak and Dagger and Moon Knight team abilities. So as a summary, this lineup and team structure initially has a good balance all around, with damage blocking, dive pressure, tank destroyer, final hit specialist, sniper and clutch factor abilities, as well as a primary healer who also has good crowd control and damage buffing capabilities. But again, it's also key to understand what you guys need to change to, when and why, which, as I mentioned in this video throughout, if the other team has a grouped up system and this lineup just basically will struggle, as Venom will get isolated, Groot will be susceptible to the likes of CC and pulls from Winter Soldier. Healing could then be an issue throughout. With the adjustments I've mentioned, you should be able to flexibly alter each of the heroes in this squad where required, depending on whether your team is finding success off the break or whether or not the other team is just making better adjustments throughout the game to counter your lineup. So just consider this throughout the entire game. And if you notice the other team has a good counter dive comp and basically is really grouped up tight, therefore don't wait the entire game to make your changes. Just get it over with right from the start, because you will struggle in this setup. So just make sure you're aware of that from the start. But anyways, guys, there you have it. If you've enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know down below if you have any alterations that you would make to this lineup, and let me know reasons why. If you have any cool clips or tips that you'd like to share, also let me know down below in the comments. I'm VinceSGN. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.